of her economic demise. Within 2 years, the annuity was no longer worth enough to pay for her firewood. Madame was forced to sell her house, at a ridiculously low price, since suddenly there were thousands of other people who also had to sell their houses. And once again she received in return only these stupid slips of paper, and once again, within 2 years, they were as good as worthless, and by 1797, she was nearing 90 now, she had lost her entire fortune, scraped together from almost a century of hard work, and was living in a tiny furnished room in the Rue des Coquilles. And only then, 10, 20 years too late, did death arrive, in the form of a protracted bout with a cancer that grabbed Madame by the throat, robbing her first of her appetite and then of her voice, so that she could raise not one word of protest as they carted her off to the Hôtel Dieu. There they put her in a ward populated with hundreds of the mortally ill, the same ward in which her husband had died, laid her in a bed shared with total strangers, pressing body upon body with 5 other women, and for 3 long weeks let her die in public view. She was then sewn into a sack, tossed onto a tumbril at 4 in the morning with 50 other corpses, to the faint tinkle of a bell driven to the newly founded cemetery of Clamart, a mile beyond the city gates, and there laid in her final resting place, a mass grave beneath a thick layer of quicklime. That was in the year 1799. Thank God, Madame had suspected nothing of the fate awaiting her as she walked home that day in 1746, leaving Grenouille and our story behind. She might possibly have lost her faith in justice, and with it the only meaning that she could make of life. 6. From his first glance at Monsieur Grimal, no, from the first breath that sniffed in the odour enveloping Grimal, Grenouille knew that this man was capable of thrashing him to death for the least infraction. His life was worth precisely as much as the work he could accomplish, and consisted only of whatever utility Grimal ascribed to it. And so Grenouille came to heel, never once making an attempt to resist. With each new day he would bottle up inside himself the energies of his defiance and contumacy, and expend them solely to survive the impending ice age in his tick-like way. Tough, uncomplaining, inconspicuous, he tended the light of life's hopes as a very small but carefully nourished flame. He was a paragon of docility, frugality, and diligence in his work, obeyed implicitly, and appeared satisfied with every meal offered. In the evening he meekly let himself be locked up in a closet off to one side of the tannery floor, where tools were kept, and the raw salted hides were hung. There he slept on the hard, bare earthen floor. During the day he worked as long as there was light, 8 hours in winter, 14, 15, 16 hours in summer. He scraped the meat from bestially stinking hides, watered them down, de-haired them, limed, baited, and fulled them, rubbed them down with pickling dung, chopped wood, stripped bark from birch and yew, climbed down into the tanning pits filled with caustic fumes, layered the hides and pelts just as the journeyman ordered him, spread them with smashed gall-nuts, covered this ghastly funeral pyre with yew branches and earth. Years later he would have to dig them up again and retrieve these mummified hide carcasses, now tanned leather, from their grave. When he was not burying or digging up hides, he was hauling water. For months on end he hauled water up from the river, always in 2 buckets, hundreds of bucketfuls a day, for tanning requires vast quantities of water, for soaking, for boiling, for dyeing. For months on end the water-hauling left him without a dry stitch on his body. By evening his clothes were dripping wet, and his skin was cold and swollen like a soaked chamois. After 1 year of an existence more animal than human, he contracted anthrax, a disease feared by tanners, and usually fatal. Grimal had already written him off, and was looking around for a replacement, not without regret, by the way, for he had never before had a more docile and productive worker than this Grenouille. But contrary to all expectation, Grenouille survived the illness. All he bore from it was scars from the large black carbuncles behind his ears and on his hands and cheeks, leaving him disfigured and even uglier than he had been before. It also left him immune to anthrax, an invaluable advantage, so that now he could strip the foulest hides with cut and bleeding hands and still run no danger of reinfection. This set him apart, not only from the apprentices and journeymen, but also from his own potential successors. And because he could no longer be so easily replaced as before, the value of his work, and thus the value of his life, increased. Suddenly he no longer had to sleep on bare earth, but was allowed to build himself a plank bed in the closet, was given straw to scatter over it, and a blanket of his own. He was no longer locked in at bedtime. His food was more adequate. Grimald no longer kept him as just any animal, but as a useful house pet. When he was 12, Grimald gave him half of Sunday off, and at 13 he was even allowed to go out on weekend evenings for an hour after work and do whatever he liked. He had triumphed, for he was alive, and he possessed a small quantum of freedom sufficient for survival. The days of his hibernation were over. Grenouille the tick stirred again. He caught the scent of morning. He was seized with an urge to hunt. The greatest preserve for odours in all the world stood open before him, the city of Paris. 7. It was like living in Utopia. The adjacent neighbourhoods of Saint-Jacques-de-la-Boucherie and Saint-Eustache were a wonderland. In the narrow side streets off the Rue Saint-Denis and the Rue Saint-Martin, people lived so densely packed, each house so tightly pressed to the next, 5, 6 stories high, that you could not see the sky, and the air at ground level formed damp canals where odours congealed. It was a mixture of human and animal smells, of water and stone and ashes and leather, of soap and fresh-baked bread and eggs boiled in vinegar, of noodles and smoothly polished brass, of sage and ale and tears, of grease and soggy straw and dry straw. Thousands upon thousands of odours formed an invisible gruel that filled the street ravines, only seldom evaporating above the rooftops and never from the ground below. The people who lived there no longer experienced this gruel as a special smell. It had arisen from them, and they had been steeped in it over and over again. It was, after all, the very air they breathed, and from which they lived. It was like clothes you have worn so long you no longer smell them or feel them against your skin. Grenouille, however, smelled it all, as if for the first time. And he did not merely smell the mixture of odours in the aggregate, but he dissected it analytically into its smallest and most remote parts and pieces. His discerning nose unravelled the knot of vapour and stench into single strands of unitary odours that could not be unthreaded further. Unwinding and spinning out these threads gave him unspeakable joy. He would often just stand there, leaning against a wall or crouching in a dark corner, his eyes closed, his mouth half open and nostrils flaring wide, quiet as a feeding pike in a great, dark, slowly moving current. And when at last a puff of air would toss a delicate thread of scent his way, he would lunge at it and not let go. Then he would smell at only this one odour, holding it tight, pulling it into himself and preserving it for all time. The odour might be an old acquaintance, or a variation on one. It could be a brand-new one as well, with hardly any similarity to anything he had ever smelled, let alone seen, till that moment. The odour of pressed silk, for example, the odour of a wild-thyme tea, the odour of brocade embroidered with silver thread, the odour of a cork from a bottle of vintage wine, the odour of a tortoise-shell comb. Grenouille was out to find such odours still unknown to him. He hunted them down with the passion and patience of an angler, and stored them up inside him. When he had smelled his fill of the thick gruel of the streets, he would go to airier terrain, where the odours were thinner, mixing with the wind as they unfurled, much as perfume does, To the market of Les Halles, for instance, where the odours of the day lived on into the evening, invisibly but ever so distinctly, as if the vendors still swarmed among the crowd, as if the baskets still stood there, stuffed, full of vegetables and eggs, or the casks full of wine and vinegar, the sacks with their spices and potatoes and flour, the crates of nails and screws, the meat tables, the tables full of cloth and dishes and shoe soles, and all the hundreds of other things sold there during the day. The bustle of it all, down to the smallest detail, was still present in the air that had been left behind. Grenouille saw the whole market smelling, if it can be put that way, and he smelled it more precisely than many people could see it, for his perception was after the fact, and thus of a higher order, an essence, a spirit of what had been, something undisturbed by the everyday accidents of the moment, like noise, glare, or the nauseating press of living human beings. Or he would go to the spot where they had beheaded his mother, to the Place de Grève, which stuck out to lick the river like a huge tongue. Here lay the ships, pulled up onto shore or moored to posts, and they smelled of coal and grain and hay and damp ropes. And from the west, via this one passage cut through the city by the river, came a broad current of wind, bringing with it odours of the country, of the meadows around Neuilly, of the forests between Saint-Germain and Versailles, of far-off cities like Rouen or Caen, and sometimes of the sea itself. The sea smelled like a sail whose billows had caught up water, salt, and a cold sun. It had a simple smell, the sea, but at the same time it smelled immense and unique, so much so that Grenouille hesitated to dissect the odours into fishy, salty, watery, seaweedy, fresh airy, and so on. He preferred to leave the smell of the sea blended together, preserving it as a unit in his memory, relishing it whole. The smell of the sea pleased him so much that he wanted one day to take it in, pure and unadulterated, in such quantities that he could get drunk on it. And later, when he learned from stories how large the sea is, and that you can sail upon it in ships for days on end without ever seeing land, nothing pleased him more than the image of himself sitting high up in the crow's nest of the foremost mast on such a ship, gliding on through the endless smell of the sea, which really was no smell, but a breath, an exhalation of breath, the end of all smells, dissolving with pleasure in that breath. But it was never to be, for Grenouille, who stood there on the river-bank at the Place de Grève, steadily breathing in and out the scraps of sea breeze that he could catch in his nose, would never in his life see the sea, the real sea, the immense ocean that lay to the west, and would never be able to mingle himself with its smell. He had soon so thoroughly smelled out the quarter between Saint-Eustache and the Hôtel de Ville that he could find his way around in it by pitch-dark night. And so he expanded his hunting grounds, first westward to the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, then out along the Rue Saint-Antoine to the Bastille, and finally across to the other bank of the river, into the quarters of the Sorbonne and the Faubourg Saint-Germain, where the rich people lived. Through the wrought-iron gates at their portals came the smells of coach-leather and of the powder in the pages' wigs, and over the high walls passed the garden odours of broom and roses and freshly trimmed hedges. It was here as well that Grenouille first smelled perfume in the literal sense of the word, a simple lavender or rose water with which the fountains of the gardens were filled on gala occasions, but also the more complex, more costly scents of tincture of musk mixed with oils of neroli and tuberose, jonquil, jasmine, or cinnamon that floated behind the carriages like rich ribbons on the evening breeze. He made note of these scents, registering them just as he would profane odours, with curiosity, but without particular admiration. Of course he realized that the purpose of perfumes was to create an intoxicating and alluring effect, and he recognized the value of the individual essences that comprised them. But on the whole they seemed to him rather coarse and ponderous, more slapdashed together than composed, and he knew that he could produce entirely different fragrances if he only had the basic ingredients at his disposal. He knew many of these ingredients already from the flower and spice stalls at the market. Others were new to him, and he filtered them out from the aromatic mixture and kept them unnamed in his memory. Ambergris, civet, patchouli, sandalwood, bergamot, vetiver, opoponax, benzoin, hop blossom, castor. He was not particular about it. He did not differentiate between what is commonly considered a good and a bad smell, not yet. He was greedy. The goal of the hunt was simply to possess everything the world could offer in the way of odours, and his only condition was that the odours be new ones. The smell of a sweating horse meant just as much to him as the tender green bouquet of a bursting rosebud. The acrid stench of a bug was no less worthy than the aroma rising from a larded veal roast in an aristocrat's kitchen. He devoured everything, sucking it up into him. But there were no aesthetic principles governing the olfactory kitchen of his imagination, where he was forever synthesizing and concocting new aromatic combinations. He fashioned grotesqueries, only to destroy them again immediately, like a child playing with blocks, inventive and destructive, with no apparent norms for his creativity. 8. On September 1st, 1753, the anniversary of the King's coronation, the city of Paris set off fireworks at the Pont Royal. The display was not as spectacular as the fireworks celebrating the King's marriage, or as the legendary fireworks in honour of the Dauphin's birth, but it was impressive nonetheless. They had mounted golden sun-wheels on the masts of the ships. From the bridge itself, so-called fire-bulls spewed showers of burning stars into the river. And while from every side came the deafening roar of petards exploding and of firecrackers skipping across the cobblestones, rockets rose into the sky and painted white lilies against the black firmament. Thronging the bridge and the quays along both banks of the river, a crowd of many thousands accompanied the spectacle with ahs and ohs, and even some long lives, although the king had ascended his throne more than 38 years before, and the high point of his popularity was long since behind him. Fireworks can do that. Grenouille stood silent in the shadow of the Pavillon de Flore, across from the Pont Neuf on the right bank. He did not stir a finger to applaud, did not even look up at the ascending rockets. He had come in hopes of getting a whiff of something new, but it soon became apparent that fireworks had nothing to offer in the way of odours. For all their extravagant variety, as they glittered and gushed and crashed and whistled, they left behind a very monotonous mixture of smells: sulphur, oil, and saltpetre. He was just about to leave this dreary exhibition and head homewards along the gallery of the Louvre, when the wind brought him something, a tiny, hardly noticeable something, a crumb, an atom of scent. No, even less than that. It was more the premonition of a scent than the scent itself, and at the same time it was definitely a premonition of something he had never smelled before. He backed up against the wall, closed his eyes, and flared his nostrils. The scent was so exceptionally delicate and fine that he could not hold on to it. It continually eluded his perception, was masked by the powder smoke of the petards, blocked by the exudations of the crowd, fragmented and crushed by the thousands of other city odours. But then, suddenly, it was there again, a mere shred, the whiff of a magnificent premonition for only a second, and it vanished at once. Grenouille suffered agonies. For the first time, it was not just that his greedy nature was offended, but his very heart ached. He had the prescience of something extraordinary. This scent was the key for ordering all odours. One could understand nothing about odours if one did not understand this one scent, and his whole life would be bungled if he, Grenouille, did not succeed in possessing it. He had to have it. not simply in order to possess it, but for his heart to be at peace. He was almost sick with excitement. He had not yet even figured out what direction the scent was coming from. Sometimes there were intervals of several minutes before a shred was again wafted his way, and each time he was overcome by the horrible anxiety that he had lost it forever. He was finally rescued by a desperate conviction that the scent was coming from the other bank of the river, from somewhere to the southeast. He moved away from the wall of the Pavillon de Flore, dived into the crowd, and made his way across the bridge. Every few strides he would stop and stand on tiptoe in order to take a sniff from above people's heads, at first smelling nothing for pure excitement. Then, finally, there was something. He smelled the scent, stronger than before, knew that he was on the right track, dived in again, burrowed through the throng of gapers and pyrotechnicians unremittingly setting torch to their rocket fuses, lost the scent in the acrid smoke of the powder, panicked, shoved and jostled his way through, and burrowed onward, and after countless minutes reached the far bank, the Hôtel de Mailly, the Quai Malaquais, the entrance to the Rue de Seine. Here he stopped, gathering his forces, and smelled. He had it. He had hold of it tight. The odour came rolling down the Rue de Seine like a ribbon, unmistakably clear, and yet, as before, very delicate and very fine. Grenouille felt his heart pounding, and he knew that it was not the exertion of running that had set it pounding, but rather his excited helplessness in the presence of this scent. He tried to recall something comparable, but had to discard all comparisons. This scent had a freshness, but not the freshness of limes or pomegranates, not the freshness of myrrh or cinnamon bark or curly mint or birch or camphor or pine needles, nor that of a May rain or a frosty wind or of well water. And at the same time it had warmth, but not as bergamot, cypress, or musk has, or jasmine, or daffodils, not as rosewood has, or iris. This scent was a blend of both, of evanescence and substance, not a blend, but a unity, although slight and frail as well, and yet solid and sustaining, like a piece of thin, shimmering silk. And yet again, not like silk, but like pastry soaked in honey-sweet milk. And try as he would, he couldn't fit those two together, milk and silk. This scent was inconceivable, indescribable, could not be categorized in any way. It really ought not to exist at all. And yet there it was, as plain and splendid as day. Grenouille followed it, his fearful heart pounding, for he suspected that it was not he who followed the scent, but the scent that had captured him, and was drawing him irresistibly to it. He walked up the Rue de Seine. No one was on the street. The houses stood empty and still. The people were down by the river watching the fireworks. No hectic odour of humans disturbed him, no biting stench of gunpowder. The street smelled of its usual smells, water, faeces, rats, and vegetable matter. But above it hovered the ribbon, delicate and clear, leading Grenouille on. After a few steps, what little light the night afforded was swallowed by the tall buildings, and Grenouille walked on in darkness. He did not need to see. The scent led him firmly. 50 yards further, he turned off to the right up the Rue des Marais, a narrow alley hardly a span wide, and darker still, if that were possible. Strangely enough, the scent was not much stronger. It was only purer, and in its augmented purity it took on an even greater power of attraction. Grenouille walked with no will of his own. At one point the scent pulled him strongly to the right, straight through what seemed to be a wall. A low entryway opened up, leading into a back courtyard. Grenouille moved along the passage like a somnambulist, moved across the courtyard, turned a corner, entered a second, smaller courtyard, and here, finally, there was light, a space of only a few square feet. A wooden roof hung out from the wall. Beneath it, a table, a candle stuck atop it. A girl was sitting at the table cleaning yellow plums. With her left hand she took the fruit from a basket, stemmed and pitted it with a knife, and dropped it into a bucket. She might have been 13, 14 years old. Grenouille stood still. He recognized at once the source of the scent that he had followed from half a mile away on the other bank of the river. Not this squalid courtyard, not the plums. The source was the girl. For a moment he was so confused that he actually thought he had never in all his life seen anything so beautiful as this girl, although he only caught her from behind in silhouette against the candlelight. He meant, of course, he had never smelled anything so beautiful. But since he knew the smell of humans, knew it 1,000-fold, men, women, children, he could not conceive of how such an exquisite scent could be emitted by a human being. Normally, human odour was nothing special, or it was ghastly. Children smelled insipid, men urinous, all sour sweat and cheese. Women smelled of rancid fat and rotting fish. Totally uninteresting, repulsive, that was how humans smelled. And so it happened that for the first time in his life, Grenouille did not trust his nose, and had to call on his eyes for assistance, if he was to believe what he smelled. This confusion of senses did not last long at all. Actually, he required only a moment to convince himself optically, then to abandon himself all the more ruthlessly to olfactory perception. And now he smelled that this was a human being, smelled the sweat of her armpits, the oil in her hair, the fishy odour of her genitals, and smelled it all with the greatest pleasure. Her sweat smelled as fresh as the sea breeze, the tallow of her hair as sweet as nut oil, her genitals were as fragrant as the bouquet of water-lilies, her skin as apricot blossoms, and the harmony of all these components yielded a perfume so rich, so balanced, so magical, that every perfume that Grenouille had smelled until now, every edifice of odours that he had so playfully created within himself, seemed at once to be utterly meaningless. 100,000 odours seemed worthless in the presence of this scent. This one scent was the higher principle, the pattern by which the others must be ordered. It was pure beauty. Grenouille knew for certain that unless he possessed this scent, his life would have no meaning. He had to understand its smallest detail, to follow it to its last delicate tendril. The mere memory, however complex, was not enough. He wanted to press, to emboss this apotheosis of scent on his black, muddled soul, meticulously to explore it, and from this point on, to think, to live, to smell only according to the innermost structures of its magic formula. He slowly approached the girl, closer and closer, stepped under the overhanging roof, and halted one step behind her. She did not hear him. She had red hair and wore a grey sleeveless dress. Her arms were very white, and her hands yellow with the juice of the halved plums. Grenouille stood bent over her and sucked in the undiluted fragrance of her as it rose from her nape, her hair, from the neckline of her dress. He let it flow into him like a gentle breeze. He had never felt so wonderful. But the girl felt the air turn cool. She did not see Grenouille, but she was uneasy, sensed a strange chill, the kind one feels when suddenly overcome with some long-discarded fear. She felt as if a cold draught had risen up behind her, as if someone had opened a door leading into a vast, cold cellar, and she laid the paring knife aside, pulled her arms to her chest, and turned around. She was so frozen with terror at the sight of him that he had plenty of time to put his hands to her throat. She did not attempt to cry out, did not budge, did not make the least motion to defend herself. He, in turn, did not look at her, did not see her delicate freckled face, her red lips, her large sparkling green eyes. keeping his eyes closed tight as he strangled her, for he had only one concern, not to lose the least trace of her scent. When she was dead, he laid her on the ground among the plum-pits, tore off her dress, and the stream of scent became a flood that inundated him with its fragrance. He thrust his face to her skin, and swept his flared nostrils across her, from belly to breast, to neck, over her face and hair, and back to her belly, down to her genitals, to her thighs and white legs. He smelled her over from head to toe. He gathered up the last fragments of her scent under her chin, in her navel, and in the wrinkles inside her elbow. And after he had smelled the last faded scent of her, he crouched beside her for a while, collecting himself, for he was brimful with her. He did not want to spill a drop of her scent. First he must seal up his innermost compartments. Then he stood up and blew out the candle. Meanwhile, people were starting home, singing and hurrahing their way up the Rue de Seine. Grenouille smelled his way down the dark alley and out onto the Rue des Petits Augustins, which lay parallel to the Rue de Seine and led to the river. A little while later the dead girl was discovered. A hue and cry arose. Torches were lit. The watch arrived. Grenouille had long since gained the other bank. That night his closet seemed to him a palace, and his plank bed a four-poster. Never before in his life had he known what happiness was. He knew at most some very rare states of numbed contentment. But now he was quivering with happiness, and could not sleep for pure bliss. It was as if he had been born a second time. No, not a second time, the first time, for until now he had merely existed like an animal with a most nebulous self-awareness. But after today he felt as if he finally knew who he really was, nothing less than a genius, and that the meaning and goal and purpose of his life had a higher destiny, nothing less than to revolutionize the odoriferous world, and that he alone in all the world possessed the means to carry it off, namely, his exquisite nose, his phenomenal memory, and, most important, the master scent taken from that girl in the Rue des Marais. Contained within it was the magic formula for everything that could make a scent, a perfume, great: delicacy, power, stability, variety, and terrifying, irresistible beauty. He had found the compass for his future life, and like all gifted abominations, for whom some external event makes straight the way down into the chaotic vortex of their souls, Grenouille never again departed from what he believed was the direction fate had pointed him. It was clear to him now why he had clung to life so tenaciously, so savagely. He must become a creator of scents, and not just an average one, but rather the greatest perfumer of all time. And during that same night, at first awake and then in his dreams, he inspected the vast rubble of his memory. He examined the millions and millions of building blocks of odour and arranged them systematically, good with good, bad with bad, fine with fine, coarse with coarse, fetid with fetid, ambrosial with ambrosial. In the course of the next week, this system grew ever more refined, the catalogue of odours ever more comprehensive and differentiated, the hierarchy ever clearer. And soon he could begin to erect the first carefully planned structures of odour: houses, walls, stairways, towers, cellars, rooms, secret chambers, an inner fortress built of the most magnificent odours, that each day grew larger, that each day grew more beautiful and more perfectly framed. A murder had been the start of this splendour. If he was at all aware of the fact, it was a matter of total indifference to him. Already he could no longer recall how the girl from the Rue des Marais had looked, not her face, not her body. He had preserved the best part of her and made it his own. the principle of her scent. 9. There were a baker's dozen of perfumers in Paris in those days. 6 of them resided on the right bank, 6 on the left, and 1 exactly in the middle, that is, on the Pont au Change, which connected the right bank with the Ile de la Cité. This bridge was so crammed with 4-story buildings that you could not glimpse the river when crossing it, and instead imagined yourself on solid ground on a perfectly normal street, and a very elegant one at that. Indeed, the Pont au Change was considered one of the finest business addresses in the city. The most renowned shops were to be found here. Here were the goldsmiths, the cabinet-makers, the best wig-makers and purse-makers, the manufacturers of the finest lingerie and stockings, the picture-framers, the merchants for riding boots, the embroiderers of epaulettes, the moulders of gold buttons, and the bankers. And here as well stood the business and residence of the perfumer and glover Giuseppe Baldini. Above his display window was stretched a sumptuous green-lacquered baldachin, next to which hung Baldini's coat of arms, all in gold, a golden flacon, from which grew a bouquet of golden flowers. And before the door lay a red carpet, also bearing the Baldini coat of arms embroidered in gold. When you opened the door, Persian chimes rang out, and 2 silver herons began spewing violet-scented toilet water from their beaks into a gold-plated vessel, which in turn was shaped like the flacon in the Baldini coat of arms. Behind the counter of light boxwood, however, stood Baldini himself, old and stiff as a pillar, in a silver-powdered wig and a blue coat adorned with gold frogs. A cloud of the frangipani, with which he sprayed himself every morning, enveloped him almost visibly, removing him to a hazy distance. So immobile was he looked like part of his own inventory. Only if the chimes rang and the herons spewed, both of which occurred rather seldom, did he suddenly come to life, his body folding up into a small scrambling figure that scurried out from behind the counter with numerous bows and scrapes, so quickly that the cloud of frangipani could hardly keep up with him, and bade his customer take a seat, while he exhibited the most exquisite perfumes and cosmetics. Baldini had thousands of them. His stock ranged from essence absolue, floral oils, tinctures, extracts, secretions, balms, resins, and other drugs in dry, liquid, or waxy form, through diverse pomades, pastes, powders, soaps, creams, sachets, bandolines, brilliantines, moustache waxes, wart removers, and beauty spots, all the way to bath oils, lotions, smelling salts, toilet vinegars, and countless genuine perfumes. But Baldini was not content with these products of classic beauty care. It was his ambition to assemble in his shop everything that had a scent or in some fashion contributed to the production of scent. And so, in addition to incense pastils, incense candles, and cords, there were also sundry spices, from anise seeds to zapota seeds, syrups, cordials, and fruit brandies, wines from Cyprus, Malaga, and Corinth, honeys, coffees, teas, candied and dried fruits, figs, bonbons, chocolates, chestnuts, and even pickled capers, cucumbers, and onions, and marinated tuna, plus perfumed sealing waxes, stationery, lovers' ink scented with attar of roses, writing kits of Spanish leather, pen holders of white sandalwood, caskets and chests of cedar wood, potpourris and bowls for flower petals, brass incense holders, crystal flacons and cruses with stoppers of cut amber, scented gloves, handkerchiefs, sewing cushions filled with mace, and musk-sprinkled wallpaper that could fill a room with scent for more than a century. Naturally, there was not room for all these wares in the splendid but small shop that opened onto the street or onto the bridge, and so for lack of a cellar, storage rooms occupied not just the attic, but the whole 2nd and 3rd floors, as well as almost every room facing the river on the ground floor. The result was that an indescribable chaos of odours reigned in the house of Baldini. However exquisite the quality of individual items, for Baldini bought wares of only highest quality, the blend of odours was almost unbearable, as if each musician in a 1,000-member orchestra were playing a different melody at fortissimo. Baldini and his assistants were themselves inured to this chaos, like aging orchestra conductors, all of whom are hard of hearing, of course, and even his wife, who lived on the 4th floor, bitterly defending it against further encroachments by the storage area, hardly noticed the many odours herself any more. Not so the customer entering Baldini's shop for the first time. The prevailing mishmash of odours hit him like a punch in the face. Depending on his constitution, it might exalt or daze him, but in any case caused such a confusion of senses that he often no longer knew what he had come for. Errand boys forgot their orders, belligerent gentlemen grew queasy, and many ladies took a spell, half hysteric, half claustrophobic, fainted away, and could be revived only with the most pungent smelling salts of clove oil, ammonia, and camphor. Under such conditions, it was really not at all astonishing that the Persian chimes at the door of Giuseppe Baldini's shop rang, and the silver herons spewed less and less frequently. 10. "Chenier!" Baldini cried from behind the counter, where for hours he had stood rigid as a pillar, staring at the door. "Put on your wig!" And out from among the kegs of olive oil and dangling Bayonne hams appeared Chenier, Baldini's assistant, somewhat younger than the latter, but already an old man himself, and moved toward the elegant front of the shop. He pulled his wig from his coat pocket and shoved it on his head. "Are you going out, Monsieur Baldini?" "No," said Baldini. "I shall retire to my study for a few hours, and I do not wish to be disturbed under any circumstances." "Ah, I see. You are creating a new perfume." "Correct, with which to impregnate a Spanish hide for Count Veramont. He wants something like, I think he said it's called Amor and Psyche, and comes, he says, from that bungler in the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, Pélissier? Yes, indeed, that's the bungler's name. Amor and Psyche by Pélissier. Do you know it?" Yes, I do indeed. You can smell it everywhere these days, smell it on every street corner. But if you ask me, nothing special. It most certainly can't be compared in any way with what you will create, Monsieur Baldini." "Naturally not." "It's a terribly common scent, this Amor and Psyche." "Vulgar?" "Totally vulgar, like everything from Pélissier. I believe it contains lime oil." "Really? What else?" "Essence of orange blossom, perhaps, and maybe tincture of rosemary, but I can't say for sure." "It's of no consequence at all to me in any case." "Naturally not." "I could care less what that bungler Pélissier slops into his perfumes. I certainly would not take my inspiration from him, I assure you." "You are absolutely right, monsieur." "As you know, I take my inspiration from no one. As you know, I create my own perfumes." "I do know, monsieur." "I alone give birth to them." "I know." "And I am thinking of creating something for Count Veramont that will cause a veritable furore." "I am sure it will, Monsieur Baldini." "Take charge of the shop. I need peace and quiet. Don't let anyone near me, Chenier." And with that he shuffled away, not at all like a statue, but, as befitted his age, bent over, but so far that he looked almost as if he had been beaten, and slowly climbed the stairs to his study on the 2nd floor. Chenier took his place behind the counter, positioning himself exactly as his master had stood before, and stared fixedly at the door. He knew what would happen in the next few hours. Absolutely nothing in the shop, and up in Baldini's study, the usual catastrophe. Baldini would take off his blue coat, drenched in frangipani, sit down at his desk, and wait for inspiration. The inspiration would not come. He would then hurry over to the cupboard with its hundreds of vials and start mixing them haphazardly. The mixture would be a failure. He would curse, fling open the window, and pour the stuff into the river. He would try something else. That, too, would be a failure. He would then rave and rant and throw a howling fit there in the stifling, odour-filled room. At about 7 o'clock he would come back down, miserable, trembling and whining, and say, "Chenier, I've lost my nose. I cannot give birth to this perfume. I cannot deliver the Spanish hide to the Count. All is lost. I am dead inside. I want to die, Chenier. Please help me die." And Chenier would suggest that someone be sent to Pellissier's for a bottle of Amor and Psyche, and Baldini would acquiesce, but only on condition that not a soul should learn of his shame. Chenier would swear himself to silence, and tonight they would perfume Count Véramont's leather with the other man's product. That was how it would be, no doubt of it, and Chenier only wished that the whole circus were already over. Baldini was no longer a great perfumer. At one time, to be sure, in his youth, 30-40 years ago, he had composed Rose of the South and Baldini's Gallant Bouquet, the two truly great perfumes to which he owed his fortune. But now he was old and exhausted, and did not know current fashions and modern tastes, and whenever he did manage to concoct a new perfume of his own, it was some totally old-fashioned, unmarketable stuff that within a year they had to dilute 10-to-1 and peddle as an additive for fountains. What a shame, Chenier thought, as he checked the sit of his wig in the mirror. A shame about old Baldini. A shame about his beautiful shop, because he's sure to ruin it. And a shame about me, because by the time he has ruined it, I'll be too old to take it over. 11. Giuseppe Baldini had indeed taken off his redolent coat, but only out of long-standing habit. The odour of frangipani had long ceased to interfere with his ability to smell. He had carried it about with him for decades now, and no longer noticed it at all. And although he had closed the door to his study and asked for peace and quiet, he had not sat down at his desk to ponder and wait for inspiration, for he knew far better than Chenier that inspiration would not strike. After all, it never had before. He was old and exhausted, that much was true, and was no longer a great perfumer, but he knew that he had never in his life been one. He had inherited Rose of the South from his father, and the formula for Baldini's Gallant Bouquet had been bought from a travelling Genoese spice salesman. The rest of his perfumes were old familiar blends. He had never invented anything. He was not an inventor. He was a careful producer of traditional scents. He was like a cook who runs a great kitchen with a routine and good recipes, but has never created a dish of his own. He staged this whole hocus-pocus with a study and experiments and inspiration and hush-hush secrecy, only because that was part of the professional image of a perfumer and glover. A perfumer was 50% alchemist who created miracles. That's what people wanted. Fine. That his art was a craft like any other, only he knew, and was proud of the fact. He didn't want to be an inventor. He was very suspicious of inventions, for they always meant that some rule would have to be broken. And he had no intention of inventing some new perfume for Count Véramont, nor was he about to let Chenier talk him into obtaining Amor and Psyche from Pellissier this evening. He already had some. There it stood on his desk by the window, in a little glass flacon with a cut-glass stopper. He had bought it a couple of days before. Naturally, not in person. He couldn't go to Pellissier and buy perfume in person, but through a go-between, who had used yet another go-between. Caution was necessary, because Baldini did not simply want to use the perfume to scent the Spanish hide. The small quantity he had bought was not sufficient for that in any case. He had something much nastier in mind. He wanted to copy it. That was, moreover, not forbidden. It was merely highly improper. To create a clandestine imitation of a competitor's perfume and sell it under one's own name was terribly improper. But more improper still was to get caught at it, and that was why Chenier must know nothing about it, for Chenier was a gossip. How awful that an honest man should feel compelled to travel such crooked paths! How awful that the most precious thing a man possesses, his own honour, should be sullied by such shabby dealings! But what was he to do? Count Veramont was, after all, a customer he dared not lose. He had hardly a single customer left now. He would soon have to start chasing after customers, as he had in his 20s at the start of his career, when he had wandered the streets with a boxful of wares dangling at his belly. God knew he, Giuseppe Baldini, owner of the largest perfume establishment in Paris, with the best possible address, only managed to stay out of the red by making house calls, valise in hand. And that did not suit him at all, for he was well over 60 and hated waiting in cold antechambers and parading eau de mille fleurs and 4 thieves' vinegar before old marquises, or foisting a migraine salve off on them. Besides which, there was such disgusting competition in those antechambers. There was that upstart Brouet from the Rue Dauphine, who claimed to have the greatest line of pomades in Europe, or Caltot from the Rue Mauconseil, who had managed to become purveyor to the household of the Duchesse d'Artois, or this totally unpredictable Antoine Pélissier from the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, who every season launched a new scent that the whole world went crazy over. Perfumes like Pélissier's could make a shambles of the whole market. If the rage one year was Hungary water, and Baldini had accordingly stocked up on lavender, bergamot, and rosemary to cover the demand, here came Pélissier with his air de musc, an ultra-heavy musk scent. Suddenly everyone had to reek like an animal, and Baldini had to rework his rosemary into hair oil, and sew the lavender into sachets. If, however, he then bought adequate supplies of musk, civet, and castor for the next year, Pélissier would take a notion to create a perfume called Forest Blossom, which would be an immediate success. And when, after long nights of experiment or costly bribes, Baldini had finally found out the ingredients in Forest Blossom, Pélissier would trump him again with Turkish Nights, or Lisbon Spice, or Bouquet de la Cour, or some such damn thing. The man was indeed a danger to the whole trade with his reckless creativity. It made you wish for a return to the old rigid guild laws, made you wish for draconian measures against this nonconformist, against this inflationist of scent. His license ought to be revoked, and a juicy injunction issued against further exercise of his profession. And, just on principle, the fellow ought to be taught a lesson, because this Pélissier wasn't even a trained perfumer and glover. His father had been nothing but a vinegar-maker, and Pélissier was a vinegar-maker too, nothing else. But as a vinegar-maker he was entitled to handle spirits, and only because of that had the skunk been able to crash the gates and wreak havoc in the park of the true perfumers. What did people need with a new perfume every season? Was that necessary? The public had been very content before with violet cologne and simple floral bouquets that you changed a soupçon every 10 years or so. For thousands of years people had made do with incense and myrrh, a few balms, oils, and dried aromatic herbs. And even once they had learned to use retorts and alembics for distilling herbs, flowers, and woods, and stealing the aromatic base of their vapours in the form of volatile oils, to crush seeds and pits and fruit rinds in oak presses, and to extract the scent from petals with carefully filtered oils. Even then, the number of perfumes had been modest. In those days, a figure like Pélissier would have been an impossibility, for back then, just for the production of a simple pomade, you needed abilities of which this vinegar mixer could not even dream. You had to be able not merely to distill, but also to act as maker of salves, apothecary, alchemist and craftsman, merchant, humanist and gardener, all in one. You had to be able to distinguish sheep's suet from calf's suet, a Victoria violet from a Parma violet. You had to be fluent in Latin. You had to know when heliotrope is harvested and when pelargonium blooms, and that the jasmine blossom loses its scent at sunrise. Obviously Pélissier had not the vaguest notion of such matters. He had probably never left Paris, never in all his life seen jasmine in bloom, not to mention having a whit of the Herculean elbow grease needed to wring a dollop of concrétion or a few drops of essence absolue from 100,000 jasmine blossoms. Probably he knew such things, knew jasmine, only as a bottle of dark brown liquid concentrate that stood in his locked cabinet alongside the many other bottles from which he mixed his fashionable perfumes. No, in the good old days of true craftsmen, a man like this coxcomb Pélissier would never have got his foot in the door. He lacked everything: character, education, serenity, and a sense for the hierarchy within a guild. He owed his few successes at perfumery solely to that discovery, made some 200 years before by that genius Mauritius Frangipani, an Italian, let it be noted, that odours are soluble in rectified spirit. By mixing his aromatic powder with alcohol, and so transferring its odour to a volatile liquid, Frangipani had liberated scent from matter, had etherealized scent, had discovered scent as pure scent. In short, he had created perfume. What a feat! What an epoch-making achievement! Comparable, really, only to the greatest accomplishments of humankind, like the invention of writing by the Assyrians, Euclidean geometry, the ideas of Plato, or the metamorphosis of grapes into wine by the Greeks. A truly Promethean act. And yet, just as all great accomplishments of the spirit cast both shadow and light, offering humankind vexation and misery along with their benefits, so too Frangipani's marvellous invention had its unfortunate results. For now that people knew how to bind the essence of flowers and herbs, woods, resins, and animal secretions within tinctures and fill them into bottles, the art of perfumery was slipping bit by bit from the hands of the masters of the craft and becoming accessible to mountebanks, at least a mountebank with a passably discerning nose, like this skunk Pélissier. Without ever bothering to learn how the marvellous contents of these bottles had come to be, they could simply follow their olfactory whims and concoct whatever popped into their heads or struck the public's momentary fancy. So much was certain. At age 35, this bastard Pélissier already possessed a larger fortune than he, Baldini, had finally accumulated after 3 generations of constant hard work. And Pélissier's grew daily, while his, Baldini's, daily shrank. That sort of thing would not have been even remotely possible before. That a reputable craftsman and established commerçant should have to struggle to exist, that had begun to happen only in the last few decades, and only since this hectic mania for novelty had broken out in every quarter, this desperate desire for action, this craze of experimentation, this rhodomontade in commerce, in trade, and in the sciences. Or this insanity about speed. What was the need for all these new roads being dug up everywhere, and these new bridges? What purpose did they serve? What was the advantage of being in Lyon within a week? Who set any store by that? Whom did it profit? Or crossing the Atlantic, racing to America in a month, as if people hadn't got along without that continent for thousands of years. What had civilized man lost that he was looking for out there in the jungles inhabited by Indians or Negroes? People even travelled to Lapland, up there in the north, with its eternal ice and savages who gorged themselves on raw fish. And now they hoped to discover yet another continent that was said to lie in the South Pacific, wherever that might be. And why all this insanity? Because the others were doing the same. The Spaniards, the damned English, the impertinent Dutch, whom you then had to go out and fight, which you couldn't in the least afford. One of those battleships easily cost a good 300,000 livres, and a single cannon shot would sink it in 5 minutes, for good and all, paid for with our taxes. The Minister of Finance had recently demanded 1/10 of all income, and that was simply ruinous, even if you didn't pay Monsieur his tithe. The very attitude was perverse. Man's misfortune stems from the fact that he does not want to stay in the room where he belongs. Pascal said that, and Pascal was a great man, a Frangipani of the intellect, a real craftsman, so to speak, and no one wants one of those anymore. People read incendiary books now by Huguenots or Englishmen, or they write tracts or so-called scientific masterpieces that put anything and everything in question. Nothing is supposed to be right anymore. Suddenly everything ought to be different.